My pharmacist stopped counting my pills and said, "You're listed as deceased in our system." I froze at the counter. "What do you mean deceased?" I asked, but Gloria was already turning her computer screen toward me. She pointed at a red alert flashing across my profile. "Right there. Says you died 6 months ago from an overdose. Same medication you're trying to fill right now." I didn't get it because I was clearly alive, and I'd been taking these anxiety pills for 2 years without any problems. Gloria, that has to be some kind of computer error. Systems glitch all the time. But Gloria was shaking her head, scrolling through her records. "I know this is your first time at our pharmacy, but all the chains share the same database. Cedric Sullivan, with your social security number and birth date, is marked deceased as of April 12th. She clicked to another screen. "There's even a coroner's report. Overdose of alprazolam. That's the exact medication you're trying to fill." I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself. The light suddenly seemed too bright. "This has to be a mistake," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. She looked at me carefully. "You said you just moved here recently?" 5 months ago, I said, trying to remember why I'd moved here. "My regular pharmacy was, I trailed off, realizing I couldn't remember where I'd been getting my medication before. "Mr. Sullivan, where did you move from? Which pharmacy transferred your prescription?" I pulled out the prescription paper from my new doctor. My doctor wrote this fresh, said it was easier than transferring old records. Gloria examined the prescription. "Did you tell him about your medication history? Your previous dosage?" I nodded, but couldn't remember the actual conversation. Just knew I'd been taking the same pills for anxiety. "Let me check something else," Gloria said, typing rapidly. "The death certificate was processed at St. Mary's Hospital. The body was identified by..." She paused, reading. "Jasmine Sullivan, listed as spouse. There's also a daughter. Flora Sullivan, age 7. Says here she was the one who found you." "I don't have a wife," I said immediately. "I've never been married, and I definitely don't have a daughter." Gloria's fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. "Mr. Sullivan, according to this, you were married for 3 years. Your wife filed the death certificate. She arranged the funeral. There's a whole life documented here. Look, here's the obituary." She turned the screen toward me. There was my photo, smiling, wearing a suit I didn't recognize. Gloria read aloud. "Cedric is survived by his loving wife Yasmin, daughter Flora." The room started spinning. "That's impossible. I would remember being married. I would remember having a child." Gloria pulled up another screen. "Your employment history shows you left on medical leave in March, 3 weeks before your death." She looked up at me. "Where do you work now?" I told her where I worked. "Started 5 months ago, right after I moved here." Gloria's expression grew more troubled. "So 1 month after Cedric Sullivan officially died, you started a new job with Cedric Sullivan's social security number?" It was clear she thought I stole his identity. My hand started shaking as I pulled out my driver's license. "Look, this is me. This is my ID. Issued 4 months ago when I moved here." Gloria examined it carefully. "Did you have to show documentation to get this? Birth certificate? Previous license?" The memory was foggy. I told them I lost everything in a flood. They had me fill out extra forms. Gloria set down the license slowly. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to ask you something important. Have you been to any doctors or hospitals since you moved here? Had any blood work done?" I thought about it. "Just my new doctor for the prescription. No tests." Gloria frowned. "Because any lab work would immediately flag you as deceased in the system. The fact that you got a new doctor without triggering alerts is strange. Someone would have to actively override the death flag." I swallowed thickly. "This is what I'm going to do," Gloria said, picking up her phone. "I'm going to call the contact number listed for Jasmine Sullivan. We need to understand what's happening here." She dialed before I could protest. The phone rang 3 times. Gloria put it on speaker. A woman answered, her voice cautious. "Hello? Mrs. Sullivan? This is Gloria from Walgreens Pharmacy. I'm calling about your husband, Cedric." She didn't hesitate, saying, "My husband died 6 months ago. Why are you calling me?" Gloria looked at me, then back at the phone. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have someone here claiming to be Cedric Sullivan. He has identification and is trying to fill a prescription for his anxiety medication." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then her voice came back, different now, urgent. "Don't let him leave. I'm going there right now. 20 minutes. The line went dead. Gloria and I stared at each other. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Why would she want to come here?" I asked. "If her husband is dead, why doesn't she just call the police?" Gloria's face had gone pale. "Unless she knows what really happened to you." My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I gripped the counter harder. Gloria glanced toward the consultation area behind the pharmacy counter and motioned me to follow her. My legs felt weak as I walked around the counter and into the small room with its plastic chairs and health posters on the walls. Gloria pulled the door mostly closed and locked my prescription paper in the metal safe mounted on the wall. She grabbed a clipboard and started writing down everything that had happened, her pen moving fast across the incident report form. I pulled out my phone to text my boss that I'd be late, but my fingers kept hitting the wrong keys. The automated reply popped up immediately, reminding me about the quarterly report due tomorrow. Gloria looked up from her paperwork and asked if there was anyone I wanted her to call, maybe a family member or friend, who could come sit with me. I opened my contacts list and scrolled through the handful of numbers, mostly work people and takeout places. My chest got tight when I realized I couldn't think of a single person to call. The clock on the wall showed 15 minutes had passed since the phone call. Gloria kept checking the front of the store through the small window in the door. My mouth was dry and I kept swallowing, but it didn't help. The door chime rang, and Gloria stood up quickly. Through the window, I saw a woman walk in, maybe mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and bags under her eyes. She stopped just inside the door and scanned the pharmacy until she spotted me through the consultation room window. Her face went white and she grabbed the nearest shelf to steady herself. "Oh my God," came out as barely a whisper, but I could read her lips. She walked toward us slowly, like her legs might give out at any moment. Gloria opened the door, and the woman just stood there staring at my face, studying every detail like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "You look exactly like him, exactly like my husband, but your eyes are different somehow." Gloria pulled out another chair and suggested we all sit down before someone fell over. The woman, Yasmin, sat across from me and pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She swiped through her photos and turned the screen toward me. The first picture showed a wedding, the groom wearing a navy suit I'd never owned, standing next to her in a white dress, both of them laughing at something off camera. She swiped again to show a beach vacation with a little girl building sandcastles while the man who looked like me helped her. Another swipe showed a birthday party in a backyard I didn't recognize, the man blowing out candles on a cake shaped like a guitar. I stared at each image searching for something, anything that felt familiar, but it was like looking at someone else's photo album where they'd pasted my face onto a stranger's body. The man in the pictures wore clothes I'd never buy, stood in ways I didn't stand, smiled with his whole face in a way I knew I never did. Yasmin kept swiping through more photos, each one showing a life I had no memory of living. She started talking about the last few weeks before he died, how he'd been acting strange and paranoid, forgetting things and getting confused about where he was. She said she thought it was just his anxiety getting worse because he'd been under so much stress at work. He'd started taking higher doses of his medication, but it wasn't helping. The night he didn't come home, she figured he'd gone to stay with a friend to clear his head since they'd been arguing about money. She waited until morning to really worry. She went to their bedroom to grab her phone charger and found him on the floor next to the bed. The pill bottle was empty on the nightstand, and Flora was in the doorway screaming. Yasmin's voice broke completely as she described calling 911, even though she could tell he'd been gone for hours by how cold his skin felt. The paramedics confirmed what she already knew, but they had to try anyway. Gloria reached across and handed Yasmin a tissue from the box on the table. I sat there, unable to move or speak, trying to process what she was telling me. The man in those photos had my face, but lived a completely different life, had a family I didn't remember, died in a bedroom I'd never seen. Yasmin wiped her eyes and looked at me again. Really looked at me, like she was searching for something specific in my expression. Her hand reached out like she might touch my face, but stopped halfway and pulled back. The consultation room felt too small and too hot. Gloria quietly suggested we might want to continue this conversation with the police present to document everything properly. Yasmin nodded but didn't take her eyes off me. I could see her trying to understand how I could be sitting here when she'd identified her husband's body 6 months ago, when she'd arranged his funeral, when she'd been helping their daughter deal with the grief of losing her father. I needed to know if she was lying or just confused, so I started asking her when exactly they got married, and she said June 3 years ago at the courthouse downtown with just 2 witnesses because they wanted something small. She told me the exact date without checking her phone and described how hot it was that day and how the air conditioning in the courthouse wasn't working, so everyone was sweating through the ceremony. I asked where they lived before the apartment, and she said they'd moved from a smaller place on Maple Street when she got pregnant with Flora because they needed more space. She knew the old landlord's name was Mr. Peterson and that he had a bad hip and always complained about the stairs. When I asked about birthdays and anniversaries, she rattled off dates like she'd lived them, not like she was reciting something she'd memorized. She told me about the time her husband forgot their first anniversary and tried to make up for it by cooking dinner, but burned everything and set off the smoke alarm, and they ended up eating Chinese takeout on the floor, laughing about it. The apartment complex she mentioned was called Riverside Gardens, and it was literally 5 blocks from where I live now in a different complex called Park View. She said their apartment was 3B on the 3rd floor, facing the parking lot, and the neighbor in 3A had a yappy dog that barked at everything. While she talked, I found myself tapping my fingers on the table in groups of 3, something I did when I was nervous, and she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at my hand. Her eyes got wide, and she whispered that her husband did that exact same thing, Always in threes, always with his right hand, always his middle three fingers while his thumb and pinky stayed still. She watched me tilt my head to the left, trying to understand what she was saying, and her breath caught because she said, "That's exactly how he looked when he was confused." The same angle, the same little crease between his eyebrows. Her hand moved toward my face again, but she pulled it back and pressed it against her chest instead. Gloria had been quiet, but now she cleared her throat and suggested, maybe we should get the police involved. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but just to document everything officially and help sort out this mess. She said she could call them right now and explain the situation, so they'd understand it wasn't a criminal thing, but more of an identity confusion that needed proper documentation. Yasmin nodded immediately and said that was a good idea because she needed answers, and maybe the police could help figure out what was happening. I agreed too, because I wanted someone official to see that I was real and alive and not trying to steal anyone's identity. Gloria picked up the phone and dialed while Yasmin sat across from me, unable to look away from my face. She kept starting to say something, then stopping herself, opening her mouth, then closing it again like she was scared of what might come out if she actually spoke. Her hands kept moving toward me, then pulling back, and she'd grip the edge of the table instead until her knuckles turned white. Gloria explained the situation to whoever answered, and after a few minutes she hung up and said 2 officers would be here in about 15 minutes. We sat there waiting, and the silence felt heavy and strange. Yasmin kept staring at me, and I could see her eyes moving over my face like she was memorizing every detail, or maybe comparing it to her memories. A couple times she started crying again, but wiped her eyes quickly and went back to staring. Gloria tried to make small talk about the weather, but none of us really responded, and eventually she just sat there typing on her computer. The door chimed, and 2 patrol officers walked in looking professional but curious. They came over to our consultation room and Gloria explained the situation while showing them her computer screen with all the death records. The officers looked at each other, then at me, then back at the screen. The taller one, whose badge said Miller, pulled out his radio and called in my driver's license number. After a minute, the dispatcher confirmed that Cedric Sullivan, with my social security number, was flagged as deceased in their system too. Officer Miller said they needed to call in a detective because this was beyond a regular patrol issue. The shorter officer, Rodriguez, started taking notes and asked each of us to explain what we knew. Gloria went first and told them about me trying to fill the prescription and finding the death flag in the system. Then she explained calling Yasmin and showing us all the documentation. Yasmin told them about her husband dying 6 months ago and how she'd identified the body and arranged the funeral. She showed them the photos on her phone and pointed out all the similarities between me and her dead husband. When it was my turn, I explained about moving here 5 months ago and not remembering much before that, but knowing I'd never been married or had a kid. Rodriguez wrote everything down and mentioned he'd seen identity theft cases before, but never one where the person whose identity was supposedly stolen was sitting right there claiming to be themselves. Miller's radio crackled, and someone said Detective Montgomery was on his way and would be there in 20 minutes. The voice on the radio said, Montgomery wanted this treated as a non-criminal investigation for now, and suggested I come to the station voluntarily for a more detailed interview. Miller relayed the message and asked if I'd be willing to go to the station to help sort this out. I said yes immediately because I wanted this fixed, and I figured the more I cooperated, the faster we could figure out what was happening. Gloria said she'd hold my prescription in the safe until everything got sorted out and pulled a business card from her drawer. She wrote her personal cell number on the back and said she'd provide any documentation the investigation needed, and I should call if I needed anything. The detective arrived sooner than expected, a tall black man in a gray suit who introduced himself as Lyle Montgomery. He listened to the officer's summary, then looked at all of us carefully before suggesting we continue this at the station where he could take formal statements. Yasmin said she'd follow in her own car, and I rode with the detective. At the station, he led me to a small interview room with a table and 4 chairs and a camera in the corner. He had me go through my whole story again from the beginning, while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. He asked me where I lived before moving here, and I couldn't remember the exact address, just that it was somewhere north. He asked which pharmacy I used before, and I drew a blank even though I knew I'd been getting my medication somewhere for 2 years. He wanted to know my previous doctor's name, and I couldn't give him that either. Montgomery kept writing, and I could tell he found it suspicious that I couldn't remember basic details about my life from 6 months ago. But he also said I seemed genuinely confused rather than like I was lying or trying to hide something. He left me in the room, and I could see through the window as he led Jasmine to a different room down the hall. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes before Montgomery came back. He said Yasmin had told him about the months before her husband's death and how he'd been under a lot of stress at work, and they'd been having money problems. She'd mentioned that his anxiety had gotten worse, and the doctor had increased his medication dosage about a month before he died. Montgomery showed me a photocopy of the death certificate and asked if I recognized any of the information on it, and I had to admit the signature on the bottom looked like my handwriting, even though I didn't remember signing it. Montgomery picked up his phone and dialed St. Mary's Hospital, while I sat there staring at that signature that looked exactly like mine. He asked for medical records and got transferred 3 times before reaching someone named Simone Newman, who handled death certificates. She said she'd pull the original paperwork and the coroner's report by tomorrow morning since their system was down for maintenance tonight. Montgomery wrote down her direct number and told her this was part of an active investigation. She promised to have everything ready first thing. He hung up and looked at me for a long moment before saying I was free to go, but needed to stay available for more questions. He gave me his card and said not to leave town without telling him first. I walked out of the station feeling like my legs were made of jelly. The sun was setting, and I realized I'd been there for hours. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to search for doctors who could see me right away. I needed someone to verify I was actually alive and help me figure out what was happening with my medication and these missing memories. Most offices were closed, but I found an urgent care clinic that took appointments for the next morning. I booked the first slot with Dr. Melissa Perry at 7:30. Back at my apartment, I collapsed on the couch and tried to make sense of everything. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from a number I didn't recognize. The message was from someone named Braden Baird in HR at my company, saying there was an E-Verify mismatch with my social security number that came up during a routine audit. He said it was urgent and I needed to meet with him tomorrow, or they'd have to suspend my employment immediately. My stomach dropped because I couldn't afford to lose my job on top of everything else. I barely slept that night, just tossed and turned thinking about that death certificate and the family I supposedly had. The next morning, I drove to the clinic 20 minutes early and sat in the parking lot trying to calm my breathing. Dr. Perry turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes who listened to my whole crazy story without interrupting. She asked me about my medical history, and I struggled to give her anything concrete from before 5 months ago. Everything felt foggy, like trying to remember a dream. She ordered comprehensive blood work, including drug screens and vitamin levels, to rule out any physical causes for the memory issues. She said she'd help me taper off the anxiety medication safely while we figured out what was going on. She explained that the health information exchange system had lots of gaps and glitches, which might explain why my death flag didn't trigger when I became her patient 5 months ago. Sometimes smaller clinics weren't connected to the main database, or staff would override alerts if the system was acting up. She documented everything carefully in my chart and said she'd coordinate with Detective Montgomery's investigation. She gave me a prescription for a lower dose of my medication to start weaning off gradually. After the appointment, I drove straight to my office for the HR meeting. Braden was a young guy who looked uncomfortable as he showed me the E-Verify alert on his computer screen. The system said my social security number belonged to someone who died 6 months ago. He said they had to place me on paid administrative leave immediately while I worked to verify my identity. He handed me a thick packet of forms for the Social Security Administration to file an erroneous death determination claim. He said it happened sometimes with database errors, but he'd never seen a case with so much documentation of the death. He gave me 2 weeks to get it sorted before they'd have to start termination procedures. Meanwhile, Detective Montgomery drove to St. Mary's Hospital to meet with Simone Newman. She was an older woman who'd worked in records for 20 years and had everything ready for him. The death certificate showed the body was identified visually by Jasmine Sullivan as her husband. No DNA test or fingerprints were taken, which was standard for an apparent overdose with family identification. The autopsy summary was brief since they'd had 7 overdoses that day, and the medical examiner was overwhelmed. Simone remembered that day because it was absolute chaos with ambulances coming in every hour. They'd shortened a lot of standard procedures just to keep up with the volume. She mentioned they still had tissue samples in storage from all the overdose cases that day, in case families wanted additional testing later. Montgomery asked her to flag those samples in case DNA testing became necessary for this investigation. She made notes in the computer and said the samples would be preserved. Back at my apartment that evening, I started going through every box and drawer looking for clues about my past. Most of my stuff looked new, like I'd bought it all at once 5 months ago. In a shoebox under my bed, I found a crumpled bus ticket receipt from a city 3 hours north, dated exactly 5 months ago. I didn't remember buying it or taking that bus ride. The ticket was one way, which made even less sense. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Yasmin saying she needed to understand what was happening for Flora's sake. She wanted to meet in a public place with someone neutral present to mediate. She suggested a coffee shop downtown tomorrow afternoon. I texted back agreeing to meet because I needed answers as much as she did. The next afternoon, I walked into the coffee shop 10 minutes early and picked a corner table where I could see the door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, so I ordered a water instead of coffee. Yasmin came in carrying a folder and spotted me right away. She sat down across from me and just stared for a long moment before pulling out a piece of paper. It was a child's drawing done in crayon showing a stick figure lying on a bed with X's for eyes. The words, "Daddy sleeping," were written in shaky kid letters at the top. My stomach twisted looking at those innocent crayon marks. A 7-year-old had drawn her dead father and kept it on the fridge for 6 months. Yasmin's hands shook as she turned the paper over to show the date Flora had written on the back. April 13th, the day after I supposedly died. She pulled out her phone next and scrolled through old messages. "Look at these," she said, turning the screen toward me. The texts were from my phone number, but the words didn't make sense. They jumped from topic to topic, talking about people watching me and codes in the TV static. One message just said, "They know, they know, they know," over and over for 3 lines. Another talked about bugs under my skin that needed to come out. I read through dozens of these messages sent in the 3 days before the death. None of them sounded like anything I would write. The typing style was different too, with no punctuation and random capital letters everywhere. Yasmin watched my face as I scrolled through them. "He was getting worse every day," she said quietly. Then she mentioned something that changed everything. The tattoo on his shoulder, the eagle he got in college. I used to trace it with my finger when we watched TV. I pulled off my jacket and rolled up my sleeve to show her my bare shoulder. No tattoo, no scar, nothing but unmarked skin. Her eyes went wide, and she reached out like she wanted to touch my shoulder to make sure. "He had it for 8 years, she whispered. I rolled up my other sleeve too, but both shoulders were completely clean. She grabbed her phone and showed me a beach photo from 2 years ago. The man who looked exactly like me had a large eagle tattoo covering his left shoulder. We sat there staring at each other until I finally said we needed to tell Detective Montgomery about this. I called him right there and explained about the tattoo. He said this changed everything and told us to come to the station immediately. At the station, Montgomery examined the beach photos carefully and took pictures of my bare shoulders from multiple angles. He said if the body had a tattoo and I didn't, we might be dealing with a case of mistaken identity. He started making calls to get the case elevated to high priority. The next morning, I went to the Social Security office with all my documents. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass looked tired as I explained my situation. She'd seen database errors before, but never one with a full death certificate and coroner's report. She handed me a thick form for erroneous death determination and warned it could take 3 to 6 months to process. I filled out every page while she made copies of my ID and the police report Montgomery had given me. She said they'd investigate, but I shouldn't expect quick results with such complete death documentation in the system. That afternoon, Montgomery called to say Simone from the hospital records department had good news. They still had tissue samples from the body in cold storage. She could expedite DNA testing if I provided a comparison sample. I drove straight to the police station where they did a proper cheek swab with full chain of custody documentation. Montgomery said we'd have results in 2 weeks if we were lucky. My phone rang while I was driving home, and it was Braden from HR. He'd gotten my email about the death certificate issue and wanted an update. I explained about the DNA testing and the Social Security forms I'd filed. He extended my paid leave for another 2 weeks, but warned that without resolution, soon they'd have to start termination procedures. The company couldn't keep someone on payroll who was legally dead. I understood, but it still made my chest tight thinking about losing my job on top of everything else. The next day, Dr. Perry called and said she wanted me to see a psychiatrist about my memory gaps. She'd made an appointment with Dr. Galen Rubin, who specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. She thought we should rule out any psychological explanation for the missing memories. I didn't want to go, but knew I needed answers. Dr. Rubin's office was in an old medical building downtown. He was younger than I expected, with thick glasses and a gentle way of talking. The first session involved a lot of cognitive testing, with cards and word associations and number sequences. He found some minor issues with attention and short-term memory that he said were consistent with anxiety and long-term benzodiazepine use. He recommended more extensive neuropsychological testing, but said he didn't see signs of major amnesia or dissociation. During our second session, he explained that high doses of anxiety medication combined with severe stress could cause memory fragmentation. The brain sometimes protected itself by blocking out traumatic periods. He'd seen cases where people lost weeks or months, though rarely as extensively as my situation. He said the medication I'd been taking could definitely cause blackouts and memory problems at high doses. 3 days passed before Gloria called my cell while I was sorting through old receipts at my kitchen table. She told me she'd been doing research on her own time and found 3 other cases across the country where death certificates got filed wrong. None of them had as much paperwork as mine, though, just simple clerical errors that got fixed pretty quick. She said she'd keep looking and would let me know if she found anything else that might help my case. Meanwhile, Detective Montgomery left a voicemail saying he'd gotten security footage from an ATM across from where they found the body 6 months ago. I drove to the station that afternoon, and he showed me the grainy black and white video on his computer screen. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. on April 12th, and there was a figure walking past the ATM camera. Montgomery paused it and zoomed in, but the image just got more blurry. The person was about my height and build, but their face was turned away, and they wore a dark jacket with the hood up. He played it again frame by frame, but we couldn't tell if it was me or someone else entirely. Montgomery said he'd send it to the state lab for enhancement, but warned me not to expect much from such poor quality footage. That evening, Yasmin emailed me a scanned copy of what she said was our marriage certificate from 3 years ago. I printed it out and sat at my desk studying every line with a magnifying glass I'd bought at the drugstore. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but something was off about it. The letters were shaky and uneven, like someone signing while drunk or sick, or maybe being forced to write. I compared it to my current signature on some paperwork, and while the basic shape was the same, the marriage one looked wrong somehow. I scanned both signatures and sent them to Montgomery, who said he'd have a handwriting expert take a look. The next morning, I decided to visit the apartment complex where Jasmine said we'd lived together before the death. It was only 15 minutes from my current place, which made my stomach feel weird. The complex looked familiar, but I couldn't tell if I actually remembered it or if my brain was playing tricks on me. I walked into the rental office and asked to speak with the maintenance supervisor. A heavy-set man in coveralls came out from the back room and stopped dead when he saw me. He said my name before I could introduce myself and told me he thought I was dead. I explained about the mix-up and asked what he remembered about me living there. He said I'd been a quiet tenant who never complained and always paid rent on time. During the last month before April, though, he said I'd seemed different, more withdrawn and jumpy. He remembered because I'd called about changing the locks twice in March, which was unusual. As we stood in the parking lot talking, an older woman came out of the building and did a double take when she saw me. She walked over slowly and asked if I was really Cedric Sullivan. When I said yes, she told me she lived in the apartment below where I'd supposedly lived with Yasmin and Flora. She said she remembered seeing me arguing with someone in the parking lot a few days before the death was reported. It was late at night, and she'd looked out her window because of the yelling. She described a man in a dark hoodie but couldn't see his face because of the shadows. The argument had gotten pretty heated, and she'd almost called the cops, but then both men left in separate cars. She couldn't remember what the fight was about, but said I'd seemed really upset and kept pointing at the other guy. I thanked her and got her contact info for Montgomery before driving back to the station. Montgomery was interested in the mystery man angle and said he'd pull any police reports from that time period. While he worked on that, Simone from the hospital called with new information. She'd been going through the autopsy report again and noticed something they'd missed before. The body had an old fracture in the left wrist that had healed years ago. She asked if I'd ever broken my wrist. I rolled up both sleeves right there in the station and held out my arms. My wrists were completely unmarked with no signs of any old breaks or injuries. Montgomery took photos from every angle and had me get x-rays at the urgent care clinic down the street. The radiologist confirmed both my wrists were perfect, with no evidence of any previous fractures. This was the first real physical proof that the body wasn't me. Montgomery tried to track down my dental records for comparison, but hit a dead end. My previous dentist's office had closed 2 years ago when the dentist retired. The records were supposedly digitized and transferred to another practice, but that office had no record of receiving them. The backup company that handled the digital storage had gone out of business 6 months ago. It was like my dental history had just vanished. 2 days later, I had my follow-up neuropsychological testing with Dr. Rubin. He ran me through hours of memory tests and cognitive exercises. The results showed some mild attention problems and a few memory gaps, but nothing that suggested major amnesia. He said the pattern was consistent with anxiety and long-term use of benzodiazepines, not psychological trauma or dissociation. The gaps in my memory were probably from the medication, not from blocking out some horrible experience. After leaving his office, I decided to take control of what I could. I went home and started creating a detailed timeline of everything I could prove about the last 5 months. I gathered every receipt, printed every work email, and documented every single thing that proved I existed. Bank statements, grocery receipts, parking stubs, even timestamps from social media posts. I organized everything chronologically in a binder, with tabs for each month. It took me 3 days, but I ended up with solid proof of my life from May through October. Then the call came earlier than expected. Montgomery's voice was different, excited almost. The DNA results had arrived a week early, and they were definitive. The body from April was not me. 0% match. He'd already started the paperwork to correct all the official records and was notifying everyone involved in the case. I sat down hard on my couch holding the phone, feeling something between relief and confusion washing over me. The next morning, I got a call from the Social Security office saying they'd received Montgomery's documentation and were expediting my case. The woman on the phone told me they'd issue a temporary verification of life letter within 2 business days, which would at least prove I existed for basic purposes. She said full resolution would take longer, but this would help with immediate needs like employment verification. I thanked her and immediately forwarded the case number to Braden at HR, who'd been waiting for any kind of official documentation. He called back within an hour saying the temporary letter would be enough to let me return to work part-time remotely while everything else processed. He even apologized for the whole situation and said he was impressed with how I'd handled such a bizarre circumstance. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table and logged into the company system for the first time in weeks, seeing dozens of emails from coworkers asking if I was okay. That afternoon my phone rang. and it was Yasmin crying, so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying if the body wasn't me, then who was her husband, and who had she been married to for 3 years? The relief mixed with confusion in her voice made my chest tight as she apologized over and over about the insurance situation. She asked if I could help her make a statement to the insurance company to prevent fraud charges since she'd filed a death benefit claim in good faith thinking her husband had died. I told her of course I'd help, and we agreed to both contact the investigator. The insurance investigator called me the next day about the frozen death benefit claim, and I spent an hour on the phone providing a sworn statement about the misidentification. He recorded everything, and said my cooperation would help ensure Yasmin wouldn't face criminal charges since she genuinely believed her husband had died based on the official death certificate. He mentioned they'd now investigate who actually died and why that person had my identification, which opened up a whole different set of questions nobody had answers for yet. Dr. Perry called to schedule an appointment, now that we understood the situation better, and when I went in, she adjusted my medication plan completely. She prescribed a different anxiety medication that was safer with fewer memory side effects and gave me a referral to a therapist who specialized in identity issues and medical trauma. She said what I'd been through was genuinely traumatic, even if we didn't fully understand it, and I needed professional support to process everything. The therapist turned out to be a calm woman in her 50s who listened to my whole story without judgment. After our third session, she suggested that a supervised meeting with Flora might help both of us process this strange situation, since the little girl had been grieving someone with my face. She called Yasmin while I was there, and they discussed it for 20 minutes before Yasmin agreed, saying she wanted her daughter to understand that death wasn't always what it seemed. The meeting was set up at a neutral location, a community center with a playroom where the therapist could observe. Flora walked in holding her mom's hand and stopped when she saw me, her eyes getting wide but not scared exactly, more confused. The therapist had prepped her that she'd meet someone who looked like Daddy but wasn't Daddy, and Flora seemed to understand that distinction better than any of us expected. We sat at a small table with paper and crayons, and I didn't pretend to be her father, but just talked to her as someone who understood feeling confused and lost. She drew a picture of a butterfly while I drew a tree, and we didn't talk much, but she seemed relieved somehow to see a familiar face, even if the person behind it was different. Her mom watched from across the room, wiping tears as Flora showed me her butterfly and explained it was orange because orange was happy. After an hour, Flora hugged me quickly before leaving and whispered that I smelled different from Daddy, which was good because it meant I was real. Detective Montgomery called that evening to officially close my part of the investigation, since the DNA proved definitively there was no fraud or criminal activity on my part. He said he was shifting focus entirely to identifying who actually died and why that person had been carrying my identification at the time of death. He had some leads but couldn't share details yet, though he promised to keep me informed of any developments that affected me directly. 2 days later, I got a text from Gloria at the pharmacy saying the Vital Records Department had officially rescinded the death certificate and updated the pharmacy database. She added a smiley face and said I could finally fill my prescription whenever I was ready without any more death flags blocking the system. The Social Security Administration called the following week to confirm they'd fully reactivated my number, and I spent the afternoon on the phone with credit agencies placing fraud alerts on everything. The woman at Experian said she'd seen cases of mistaken death before, but never one this complex with an actual body and funeral involved. By the end of the week, my life administratively existed again, though now with more security measures and verification steps than before. The next Monday, I walked into Braden's office at HR with all my paperwork sorted, and he smiled when he saw the stack of documents I'd brought. He typed up the official return-to-work letter right there and mentioned they'd make sure I could leave for doctor appointments whenever needed. My desk was exactly how I'd left it, and my coworkers asked a few questions, but mostly just seemed glad to have me back. We all agreed to focus on getting the quarterly reports done instead of talking about what had happened. The insurance investigator called that afternoon needing one more sworn statement to close out Yasmin's case. I spent an hour on the phone going through everything again and making it clear she'd made an honest mistake, identifying the body. The investigator said they'd shift their focus to finding out who actually died and wouldn't pursue any fraud charges against her. 2 days later, Simone from the hospital called my cell while I was eating lunch at my desk. She thanked me for being so patient with the whole mess and mentioned they were changing how they identify bodies now. She said sometimes it takes a weird case to make the system better for everyone else. That Thursday, I had my regular appointment with Dr. Rubin, and we spent most of the time working on breathing exercises for my anxiety. He said we might never figure out what happened during those missing weeks, but I was learning to be okay with not knowing everything. We adjusted my medication dose slightly and scheduled appointments for the next 3 months. Yasmin texted me that weekend, asking if we could meet at a coffee shop to talk about Flora. We sat outside and worked out a plan where I'd see Flora once a month at the community center with the therapist there. Yasmin said it was helping Flora understand that people don't always stay gone forever, even if they're not exactly who you thought they were. The visits would be supervised, but Flora seemed to like having someone around who looked familiar, even if I wasn't actually her dad. 3 months passed and I was back at work full-time with a good routine going. My memories still had gaps, but I'd made enough new ones that I felt like a real person again. The medication was working better than before, and I hadn't had a panic attack in weeks. My co-workers had stopped asking questions, and we'd settled into normal office life. Flora had started 2nd grade, and during our last visit, she'd brought a picture she'd drawn of orange and yellow butterflies. Yasmin explained later that Flora said the butterflies meant things could change into something new and different. I bought a small frame at the drugstore and put the drawing on my desk at work where I could see it every day. It reminded me that weird things happen sometimes, and you end up connected to people you never expected. 6 months after that first day at the pharmacy, I walked back into the same Walgreens to fill my prescription. Gloria was working the counter, and her face lit up when she saw me walk in. She pulled up my profile on her computer and showed me the screen with no red flags or death notices anywhere. My identity was completely fixed in the system, and my insurance was working again. I handed her the prescription from Dr. Rubin, and she counted out the pills without any problems. While she worked, she mentioned she'd never seen anything like my case in 20 years of pharmacy work. I told her things were good now with my job secure and my anxiety under control. She said she was glad everything worked out, even if we never figured out exactly what happened with the other person who died. As I signed for my medication, she asked about Flora, and I told her about the butterfly drawing. Gloria smiled and said, "Sometimes the strangest situations lead to the most unexpected connections." I walked out of the pharmacy with my medication in a small white bag, thinking about how different this was from 6 months ago. My legal status was completely restored, and I had a stable life even if parts of my past were still missing. The mystery of who actually died would probably never be solved completely, but I'd made peace with that. Flora knew now that endings weren't always permanent, and that people could come back different, but still be worth knowing. I'd learned to live with uncertainty, and even found something good in the middle of all the confusion. The whole thing had been terrifying and strange, but it led to connections I never would have made otherwise. My anxiety was managed better than it had been in years, and I had a support system I didn't know I needed. Even Detective Montgomery had called last week to check in and make sure everything was still okay with my paperwork. The case was officially cold, but he said he'd keep looking into it when he had time. For now, though, I had my life back, or at least a version of it that worked. Thanks for hanging in there with me through all the questioning and wondering. Really enjoyed exploring these moments right alongside you all. Subscribe for more content like this.